So, does the Windows 11 23H2 update improve gaming performance? I don't know, but we can find out. Stay tuned. A few weeks ago, we tested the gaming performance of Windows 10 versus Windows 11. The results for Windows 11 were pretty good. However, all those tests were done on Windows 11 22H2. Now that 23H2 is out, I wondered if the new update helped gaming performance at all. To my surprise, after searching YouTube, I couldn't find a single video comparing the difference in gaming performance between 22H2 and 23H2. So, I guess I'm gonna make a video on it then. But first, we need to pay some bills. So check out today's sponsor. Is your copy of Windows 10 unactivated? Well, it doesn't have to be, because with today's sponsor, VIP SCD Key, you can get a valid Windows 10 license for under $20. Stop dealing with that stupid watermark on the desktop, the valid license for Windows 10. Also, with an activated copy of Windows 10, you can upgrade to Windows 11 for free. Just go to the link in the description below and pick up a valid Windows 10 license key. During checkout, use the code CYBERCPU for a 25% discount. Once you have your key, go to your activation settings in Windows 10 and click on the link that says Change Product Key. Enter the product key you just purchased and hit Activate. Now you don't have to deal with that stupid watermark that come with running an unactivated copy of Windows 10. Now, on with the video. So, we already know that Windows 11 23H2 comes with a lot of new and pretty cool features. I'm not going to go into those in detail because I've already done a video on it. However, do these features improve gaming performance or do they hurt gaming performance? For that, the only way to find out is to test it. The system I'm going to test this on is this one here. It's a Ryzen 5 5600 with 32 gigs of RAM. The system also has an RTX 3060. Both the CPU and GPU are water-cooled, but only the GPU is overclocked. The GPU is running a 200 MHz overclock on the core and a 1200 MHz overclock on the memory. The system is running a copy of Windows 11 that's been optimized for gaming. In fact, it's the same install of Windows 11 that I used in my video a few weeks ago testing gaming performance between Windows 10 and 11. The only difference in these benchmarks is that the system was tested first with 22H2 and then all the benchmarks were ran again with 23H2. So with all that out of the way, let's jump into the benchmarks and see how 23H2 did. The first game we're looking at today is Black Mesa. As I've said in the past, Black Mesa is a remake of Half-Life 1 in the Half-Life 2 engine. It's actually a pretty fun game. In 22H2, we got an average FPS of 192.3 with a 1% low of 114.5. Once upgrading to 23H2, we got an average FPS of 194.4 with a 1% low of 121.6. That's a 1.1% better frame rate in 23H2. However, at almost 200 FPS, this really isn't very noticeable. But we did get a 6% improvement in our 1% low. That's a pretty impressive improvement in frame timings. The next game we're testing is Counter-Strike 2. I just gotta state it again because I hope I can use my platform to get the message across to Valve. It would be really nice to get all of the old CSGO maps in Counter-Strike 2. If I had to pick just one, bring back the Militia Cabin. This was absolutely the best map, in my opinion, from CSGO. Anyway, I digress. In 22H2, CS2 got an average frame rate of 179.3 and a 1% low of 104.7. Once upgrading to 23H2, we got an average frame rate of 177.8 and a 1% low of 110.7. As you can see, we did lose 0.8% in our average frame rate, but we gained 5.6% in our 1% lows. Frame timings are very important in this game, and I'll definitely take less than a 1% hit on average frame rate for an almost 6% improvement in frame timings. The next game we're looking at is Cyberpunk 2077. If you haven't played Cyberpunk in a while, the newest update has really increased the performance of this game. In this benchmark, I have RTX and DLSS both set to balanced. In 22H2, we got an average frame rate of 55.1 with a 1% low of 45.5. Once upgrading to 23H2, we got an average frame rate of 54.5 and a 1% low of 45.3. As you can see from these numbers, we did take a 1.1% hit in our average frame rate. In fact, we even took a 0.4% hit in our 1% low. However, one thing I noticed in both 22H2 and 23H2 is the average frame rate is extremely close to the 1% low. The closer the 1% low can be to the average frame rate, the better the gameplay is. In fact, I don't have these numbers on the screen, but our 0.1% low was 40.6 in 22H2 and 41.1 in 23H2. Having a 1% low and 0.1% low that is so close to the average frame rate shows an extremely stable frame rate. Now, this is just a side note because I don't believe this has anything to do with Windows 11, but I do think this has to do with the latest update to Cyberpunk that has improved the performance of this game. The next game we're looking at today is Deliver Us the Moon. Now, this game is kind of a mixed bag in regards to benchmarks that I've done in the past in Windows 11. And in these tests, I got some pretty peculiar results. First off, in 22H2, I got an average frame rate of 75.9, but a 1% low of 27.1. Once updating to 23H2, I got an average frame rate of 76.8, and a 1% low of 53.9. Now, it's a modest increase in frame rate in 23H2 at 1.2%. This is definitely within margin of error. However, the peculiar results are in the frame timings. We got a 66.2% increase in frame timings in 23H2. That's a pretty big difference. 23H2 definitely won in this game. The next game we're looking at today is Dirt Rally 2. This game was included because I wanted to have a racing game in these benchmarks just to cover that genre. And it's a pretty decent looking game too. In 22H2, we got an average FPS of 85.4 and a 1% low of 69.4. Once updating to 23H2, we got an average FPS of 83.3 and a 1% low of 64.5. This is the first game that we took a pretty major hit in performance. Well, maybe major is subjective. We lost 2.5% in our average FPS and 7.3% in our frame timings. This is a pretty definitive loss for 23H2. Now, this wouldn't be benchmarks on my channel if it didn't include GTA 5. I've seen the rumor mills ramping up lately on GTA 6. Maybe we might see something soon. It would definitely be nice, but in the meantime, we're stuck with GTA 5. In 22H2, we got an average FPS of 137.3 and a 1% low of 92.9. Once updating to 23H2, we got an average FPS of 136.3 and a 1% low of 94.9. As you can see, we did take a 0.7% hit on our average frame rate. That's definitely in margin of error. But we did get a 2.1% increase in our frame timings. Since GTA is a game that can occasionally have an unstable frame rate, it's nice to see any improvement at all when it comes to frame timings. The next game we're looking at today is Red Dead Redemption 2. Since we don't have GTA 6, I guess Grand Theft Auto in the Old West is the closest we're going to get. However, this game is absolutely phenomenal. At least in my opinion. In 22H2, we got an average FPS of 81.4 and a 1% low of 68.3. Once upgrading to 23H2, we got an average FPS of 87.4 and a 1% low of 71.7. Now, right off the bat, I can say that this is clearly a win for 23H2. We got a 7.1% increase in average frame rate and a 4.9% better 1% low. This game performed better in 23H2 all around. The next game we're looking at today is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is starting to become an older game, but it definitely holds up. This is also a great game for testing because it really puts a lot of stress on the GPU. In fact, this is the game that I typically use to stress test a GPU overclock. If your overclock can get through this game, then it can pretty well get through any game. In 22H2, we got an average FPS of 109.6 and a 1% low of 98.5. Once upgrading to 23H2, I got an average FPS of 109.2 and a 1% low of 98.4. Now, as you can see, we took a hit on both average frame rate and frame timings, but just barely. Our average FPS was 0.4% worse and our 1% low was 0.1% worse. However, numbers this close, I'm gonna call a margin of error for sure. So as you can see, 23H2 actually does improve gaming performance in some cases. In fact, the only game that I saw that took a substantial performance hit was Dirt Rally 2. And that performance, it really wasn't that much. In most games, 23H2 performed the same, if not just a little bit better. In fact, the biggest benefit that I saw through this testing was frame timings in 23H2 seemed to be considerably better. To understand the difference between average frame rate and frame timings is that frame rate is essentially the average over an entire span of gameplay to your FPS. So what average frame rate doesn't take into account is the stability of your frame rate. If the majority of the time your frame rate is around 200 FPS, but you have several dips, those dips can be noticeable during gameplay. This is common with games like GTA 5. The frame rate can be great and then all of a sudden you get stuttering. That's where the 1% low or frame timings come into play. What you're doing is taking the average of the 1% worst frame rate within your average frame rate in order to determine that number. So if you have a game that gets an average FPS of 200, but your 1% low is 2 FPS, then you're definitely going to see some stuttering in that game. So the fact that the 1% lows in 23H2 show a pretty decent improvement overall just means that in 23H2 you will likely see a more consistent frame rate. And in many cases, a consistent frame rate is better than a high average frame rate. Like, I would much rather have a game that ran at 120 FPS with a 110 FPS 1% low than a game that ran at 400 FPS but had a 20 FPS 1% low. Hopefully that makes sense. And speaking of frame rate, many people might tell you that anything over 60 FPS is a waste because your eyes can't see the difference anyway. Fortunately though, I debunked that claim in this video here, where I show why our eyes actually can perceive considerably higher frame rates. In fact, the only people that can't perceive over 60 FPS are people running monitors that can't go over 60 Hz refresh rate. As always, you guys have a great day.